Hey guys, tonight we're going to open the dusty scrolls and dimly lit rooms of ancient Rome to uncover a side of their society you might not expect. We often envision Roman citizens as paragons of civic duty, eloquent orators, and military strategists. But how did they get there? Their education system. And let me tell you what education was really like in ancient Rome. Sucked. And I mean truly sucked. We're talking about a system that was brutal, exclusive, and frankly, you probably wouldn't survive past the first few years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a bustling Roman insula, a multi-storied apartment building in Rome around 100 CE. The sounds of the city, distant chariot wheels, vendors shouting, children playing, drift in through the open windows. As you observe a typical Roman family, you begin to understand a fundamental, disturbing truth about their educational system. Childhood's grim start, no universal school. Education in ancient Rome was not a right, it was a privilege, largely determined by your family's wealth, social standing, and gender. For the vast majority of Roman children, formal schooling simply wasn't an option. If you were born into a poor family, a family of laborers or enslaved individuals, your education began almost immediately with practical training. Boys would follow their fathers to the fields, the workshops, or the docks, learning a trade through arduous apprenticeship. Girls would remain at home, learning domestic skills from their mothers cooking, spinning, weaving, and managing a household. Their education was entirely focused on survival, on equipping them with the skills necessary to contribute to the family's immediate economic needs. There was no time, no money, and often no perceived need for academic pursuits, even for children of the wealthy. Formal education didn't begin immediately. For the first few years of life, a Roman child, whether boy or girl, was primarily educated at home by their mother or by an enslaved nursemaid. This early instruction focused on moral virtues, practical skills, and basic literacy. The goal was to instill the core Roman values of pietas duty, gravitas dignity, and virtus manliness abris excellence. These lessons were delivered through stories, examples, and the strict adherence to household rules. However, the decision to pursue further education, to send a child to a formal school, rested entirely with the pater familias, the absolute head of the family. And this decision was almost exclusively made for boys from affluent families. Roman girls, even from wealthy backgrounds, rarely attended formal schools beyond the very earliest stages. Their education continued at home, sometimes with private tutors, focusing on advanced domestic skills, managing a household, basic literacy for reading accounts, and perhaps some literature, preparing them primarily for marriage and motherhood. The idea of a girl becoming an orator or a public official was simply unthinkable, and thus academic education was deemed unnecessary for them. This inherent inequality meant that Roman society, for all its sophistication, was fundamentally stratified by educational opportunity. Literacy rates, while higher than some earlier ancient societies, were still far from universal. Only a minority of the male population, primarily from the wealthier classes count, would advance beyond basic literacy. This created a profound divide, where knowledge and power remained concentrated in the hands of the educated elite. Consider the children who did attend school. Their journey began around the age of 7. These were not public schools funded by the state. Instead, they were private establishments, run by a literator elementary teacher, and parents had to pay fees. This instantly created a barrier for anyone but the relatively well-off. If your family fell on hard times and your education could be abruptly cut short, sending you back to the fields or workshop, your aspirations crushed, The very concept of school was different. There were no purpose-built school buildings. Lessons often took place in a rented room, a portico in the forum, or even in the corner of a public bathhouse. Anywhere the literator could set up a few stools and a table. Imagine trying to concentrate on your lessons with the constant noise and distractions of a bustling Roman city just feet away. It's enough to drive a modern student insane. So, as you listen to the distant sounds of children playing in ancient Rome, remember that for many, that play was their only form of education. For those who did enter the formal system, it was a rare privilege, a grim start to a long, arduous, and often brutal journey. This was not the nurturing, universally accessible education we know today. It was a harsh, exclusive, and deeply unequal path. Ensuring that childhood's grim start no universal school was the reality for most. It makes your own school days seem like a picnic, doesn't it? You've grasped the grim reality that formal education in Rome was a privilege, not a right. For the few boys fortunate enough to attend, their journey began around the age of 7, under the tutelage of a literator, a brutal beginning. This wasn't the gentle, nurturing introduction to learning you might imagine. It was a harsh, often terrifying environment where crude lessons were delivered with a heavy hand. Quite literally, imagine yourself as a young Roman boy, barely 7 years old, clutching your wax tablet and stylus. You're not heading to a brightly lit, purpose-built school. Instead, your classroom might be a rented room in a cramped insula, a noisy portico in the bustling forum, or even just a corner of a public bathhouse. Anywhere the literator could set up a few stools and perhaps a small, shaky table. The air is filled with the cacophony of the city, vendors shouting, chariots rumbling, distant crowds murmuring, constantly competing with the monotonous drone of lessons. Concentration was a skill in itself, almost as difficult as the subjects you were meant to master. Your literator, the elementary teacher, was often a Greek freedman or an enslaved person, sometimes of questionable education themselves. They were rarely highly respected or well paid. Their primary job was to teach you the absolute basics reading, writing, and arithmetic. This was not a creative or engaging process. It was overwhelmingly based on rote memorization and repetitive drills. For reading, you'd start with individual letters, then syllables, then words, meticulously copying them onto your wax tablet. Imagine the dull, repetitive task of scratching out the same letter, the same simple word, over and over again, until your hand ached and your eyes blurred. There were no colorful picture books, no engaging stories to make learning fun. You'd learn from dry, didactic texts, often maxims or lists of words, designed purely for memorization. Writing was equally tedious. You'd use a stylus to scratch letters onto a wax tablet, which could then be smoothed over and reused. For more permanent work, you'd painstakingly copy text onto papyrus or parchment, materials that were expensive and therefore used sparingly. Imagine the immense effort required to form each letter perfectly. The frustration of making a mistake and having to start over, all while the literator loomed over you. Your early attempts would be clumsy. Crooked lines, a far cry from the elegant script of the adults. Arithmetic was equally uninspiring. You'd learn basic counting, addition, subtraction, and perhaps some simple multiplication using an abacus or by manipulating Pebbles calculi. This was purely practical math, focused on the calculations necessary for daily Roman life managing household accounts, measuring goods or counting money. There was no abstract theory, no playful problem solving. It was pure, unadulterated computation. But the most pervasive and terrifying aspect of this early education was the brutal discipline. The literator rarely spared the rod. Corporal punishment was not just common, it was expected. Whips made from leather or even bundles of sticks like the ferula or cane were standard teaching aids. A misspelled word, a poor calculation, a moment of inattention, or even a simple fidget could earn you a swift, stinging blow to the hand or back. Imagine sitting in constant fear, your stomach clenched, knowing that any mistake could result in physical pain. The air in the classroom would often be punctuated by the sharp crack of the cane and the whimpers or cries of a punished child. This constant threat of physical violence created a climate of fear, not a love of learning. It instilled obedience, certainly, but at the cost of genuine intellectual curiosity. It was a system designed to drill information into young minds through intimidation and repetition, rather than fostering understanding or critical thought. There was no concept of positive reinforcement or individualized learning. It was a one-size-fits-all, fear-driven approach. While vivid literary descriptions of harsh Roman schoolmasters exist, direct archaeological evidence of specific disciplinary tools used in classrooms is scarce, though the general use of physical punishment in ancient childhood is well documented. The classroom environment itself was often chaotic and noisy, with dozens of boys crammed into a small, open space, each working at their own pace. The literator would struggle to maintain order. The sounds of scratching styluses, muffled recitations, the murmur of the city, and the ever-present threat of the cane would create a jarring, stressful atmosphere. It was hardly conducive to deep learning, but rather to surviving the daily ordeal. So, as you picture a young Roman boy heading off to his first school, remember that this wasn't a journey to enlightenment. It was a descent into a brutal, monotonous, and often terrifying world of rote memorization and physical discipline. The literator's classroom was a grim beginning, ensuring that Roman education, for all its eventual grandeur, started with a whimper, often accompanied by the crack of a whip. It makes your own elementary school days seem like a glorious vacation, doesn't it? You've endured the repetitive drills and felt the sting of the literator's cane. If your family was sufficiently wealthy and ambitious, and you, the young Roman boy, showed enough promise or simply survived the literator's curriculum, your education would continue to the next, equally uninspiring. Stage the Grammaticus rote learning's reign. This was a world steeped in ancient literature, but delivered with a monotonous rigor that often stifled any genuine appreciation for the classics. Imagine yourself now, a boy of perhaps 11 or 12 years old, transitioning to the school of the Grammaticus. Just like the literator's humble setup, this wasn't a grand, dedicated institution. Lessons might still take place in a rented hall, a private corner of a public building, or even the Grammaticus's own home. The air is less chaotic than the elementary school, perhaps, but certainly no less stifling, filled with the drone of recitation and the scent of old papyrus. The core of the Grammaticus's curriculum was Latin and Greek literature. Your primary task was to read, analyze, and, most importantly, memorize vast swaths of classical texts. You'd pore over the works of revered poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ennius, or historians like Livy. In Greek, you'd tackle Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, perhaps Hesiod or the tragedians. Imagine the sheer volume of text you were expected to absorb, much of it archaic even to Roman ears, filled with complex meter and obscure allusions. This was not a journey of critical thinking or personal interpretation. The goal was accurate recitation, understanding of grammar and meter, and an appreciation, or at least recognition of rhetorical devices. You'd learn grammar by dissecting sentences, identifying parts of speech, and endlessly parsing verbs. It was an exhaustive, often dull, dissection of language, rather than a lively engagement with the ideas within the text. The Grammaticus would lecture, explain meter, and identify figures of speech. And your job was to absorb it all, unquestioningly. Recitation was paramount. You'd be called upon to stand and recite long passages from memory, perhaps even entire speeches or epic poems. Imagine the pressure, knowing that a single forgotten line, a mispronounced word, or an incorrect meter could lead to public humiliation and, yes, still the ever-present threat of physical punishment. The Grammaticus, like the literator, kept a firm hand, and the lash or cane was still a common motivator. You'd hear the rhythmic chant of other students memorizing, a dull drone that filled the classroom, broken only by the sharp correction of the teacher. Beyond the literary text, you might receive instruction in basic geometry, music theory, and astronomy. But these were typically secondary subjects. taught only insofar as they related to the understanding of classical literature. Geometry, for example, might be used to understand the dimensions of temples mentioned in epic poems. These were not subjects explored for their own sake, but as tools for literary analysis. It's a bit like learning advanced algebra just so you can fully appreciate the nuances of a Shakespearean sonnet. Not exactly the most direct path. The curriculum was explicitly elitist. The texts chosen were those of the Roman and Greek elite, reflecting their values, their history, and their understanding of the world. This education was designed to produce sophisticated, well-read young men who could participate in the intellectual conversations of the Roman upper classes. It was a cultural inheritance, passed down through generations, rather than a broad, accessible curriculum. For boys from less privileged backgrounds, even if they somehow made it this far, the subject matter might have felt disconnected from the realities of their daily lives. Homework, as we know it, also existed. You'd be assigned passages to memorize, grammatical exercises to complete, and texts to copy. This meant hours spent at home, hunched over your wax tablet or papyrus, meticulously practicing the skills drilled into you during the day. There was little time for leisure, little room for creative pursuits. Your life was structured around the relentless demands of rote learning. The social environment could also be challenging. While the grammaticus might have a slightly higher social standing than the literator, their schools were still often noisy, poorly lit, and crowded. The competition among students for the grammaticus favor, or simply to avoid punishment, could be intense. You'd sit for hours, listening to your peers stumble through recitations, trying to perfect your own, knowing your turn would come. So, as you envision a young Roman boy diligently studying the classics, remember that this was often a joyless, repetitive process. The world of the Grammaticus was dominated by rote learning's reign, where the beauty of ancient literature was often obscured by the relentless grind of memorization and grammatical dissection, all under the constant threat of discipline. It makes you almost grateful for modern teaching methods, doesn't it? You've memorized countless passages and endured the grammatical drills of the Grammaticus. For the ambitious few, particularly boys from the senatorial or equestrian orders, education didn't stop there. The next, and most crucial stage, was the school of the reader public speaking's peril. This wasn't just about learning to speak well, it was about mastering the art of persuasion, a skill absolutely essential for political power, legal success, and social advancement in ancient Rome. And the pressure was immense. Imagine yourself as a Roman teenager, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, stepping into the rhetor's lecture hall. Unlike the cramped, open spaces of earlier schools, this might be a slightly more formal setting, but still often bustling with students. The air crackles with intellectual tension, and the stakes feel palpably higher. This is where your future is truly forged, or irrevocably broken. The rhetor, often a highly respected and well-paid Greek intellectual, was tasked with teaching you the intricacies of rhetoric, the art of effective communication and persuasion. This was less about pure knowledge and more about practical performance. Your curriculum would involve deep dives into the works of great Roman orators like Cicero and Greek masters like Demosthenes. You'd analyze their speeches, dissecting their arguments, their use of language, and their techniques for swaying an audience. Your primary activity would be declamation. This involved performing prepared speeches, often on historical or fictional topics. Before your classmates in the rhetor, imagine standing before your peers, heart-pounding, delivering a passionate speech on should Hannibal have marched on Rome after Cannae, or the proper punishment for a parricide. You'd work tirelessly on your delivery, your posture, your gestures, your voice modulation, and your facial expressions. The rhetor would scrutinize every detail, offering sharp, unvarnished critiques. This wasn't just practice. It was a performance. The declamations were public, and your peers would be your harshest critics, ready to snicker at a stammer, a misplaced hand gesture, or a logical fallacy. Imagine the humiliation of fumbling your lines, or having your carefully constructed argument dismantled by your teacher in front of everyone. The pressure to excel was enormous, because your future career depended directly on your ability to persuade. While detailed pedagogical manuals from Roman rhetors are rare, surviving treatises by Quintilian and Cicero provide extensive insight into the rigorous and competitive nature of rhetorical training. The curriculum also involved learning the canons of rhetoric. Inventio invention, how to find arguments. Dispositio arrangement, how to organize your arguments effectively. Elaboratio, elaboration style, how to use eloquent language and figures of speech. Memoria memory, how to memorize long speeches. Actio delivery, how to present your speech effectively with gestures and voice. You'd spend countless hours perfecting each of these elements, endlessly rehearsing, practicing your gestures in front of a mirror, and honing your voice to achieve the perfect tone of gravitas or indignation. It was a demanding, all-consuming process, far removed from the simple literacy drills of your youth. The stakes were incredibly high. In Roman society, success in politics, law, and military leadership often hinged on oratorical prowess. A powerful speech could sway a jury, convince the Senate, or inspire legions. Conversely, a poor speaker, no matter how intelligent or well-born, would struggle to advance. Your ability to speak persuasively was your golden ticket to the highest echelons of power. Failure to master rhetoric meant a life of lesser influence, a grim prospect for an ambitious Roman youth. The curriculum was explicitly designed to prepare you for a public life dominated by the spoken word. You would debate mock legal cases, controversiae, or imagine yourself delivering political speeches, suasoria. These weren't abstract academic exercises. They were simulations of the very challenges you would face in the forum, in the courts, and in the Senate. The goal was practical mastery, not philosophical inquiry. The competition among students was fierce. Your classmates were your rivals, all vying for the same limited positions of power and influence. You'd scrutinize their performances, looking for flaws, while simultaneously trying to perfect your own. This intense competitive atmosphere could be isolating, fostering rivalry rather than camaraderie. And yes, even at this advanced stage, the threat of corporal punishment still lingered, though perhaps less frequently than with the literator. The rhetor might use more subtle forms of humiliation, but the cane was still an ever-present possibility for serious failures or insubordination. The pressure alone was often enough to keep students in line. So, as you listen to the echoes of powerful Roman speeches, remember the grueling training that produced them. The school of the rhetor was a high-pressure environment, a crucible where young men were forged into orators, their futures hanging on their ability to command words and sway minds. It was public speaking's peril, a demanding and often terrifying path that determined who would rise to the pinnacle of Roman power and who would fade into obscurity. It makes you feel pretty grateful for spell check and a mute button on video calls, doesn't it? You've mastered the art of public speaking, a crucial step for a Roman boy. But what about your sisters or the daughters of other Roman citizens? Their educational path was starkly different, revealing another deeply entrenched inequality girl's education, homebound, limited scope. While Roman society valued educated women, their learning was almost exclusively confined to the domestic sphere, preparing them for a life of marriage, motherhood, and household management. Rather than public life, imagine yourself as a young Roman girl, growing up in a respectable Roman home around 100 CE. Unlike your brothers, your school isn't in a bustling portico or a rented hall. Your classroom is your home itself, and your primary teachers are your mother, female relatives, or enslaved tutors. Your education begins early, focused not on rhetoric or philosophy, but on practical skills and moral virtues deemed essential for a Roman matron. Your initial lessons, from around age 7, would mirror your brothers in basic literacy and numeracy. You'd learn to read and write in Latin, often using a wax tablet and stylus, just like the boys. This was crucial for managing household accounts, writing letters, and understanding family documents. You might even learn basic arithmetic for managing inventories and budgets. This foundational literacy was important, ensuring you could oversee your future household efficiently. However, where your brother would then progress to the grammaticus for literary analysis, and then the rhetor for public speaking, your curriculum would diverge sharply. Your education would intensify its focus on domestic skills. You'd spend countless hours learning to spin wool and weave fabric, tasks that were fundamental to a Roman household. Imagine the repetitive motion of the spindle, the intricate work on the loom, producing clothing and textiles for your family. This wasn't merely a hobby, it was a core economic activity of the home. A skill that showcased a wife's diligence and virtue. You would also learn the intricacies of household management. This involved overseeing the enslaved staff if your family was wealthy enough to own them, ensuring meals were prepared, the house was clean, and all domestic affairs ran smoothly. You'd learn about food preservation, herbal remedies for minor ailments, and perhaps even basic accounting. This was a hands-on apprenticeship, preparing you to become the efficient and respected mistress of your own future domus. For girls from elite families, education might extend to learning Greek, either from a private tutor or from an enslaved instructor. This wasn't for public discourse, but to appreciate Greek literature, to converse with educated guests, and to engage in the cultural pursuits fashionable among the upper classes. You might read some Greek poetry or history, but always within the confines of your home, not in a public school setting. While evidence suggests some elite Roman women achieved high levels of literacy, the primary purpose of their education remained domestic and cultural refinement, not public intellectualism. Historians often debate the extent to which this private education could genuinely empower women beyond their prescribed roles. The emphasis was always on instilling Roman moral virtues. You were taught pudicitia chastity, frugalitas thriftiness, and gravitas dignity, modesty, obedience to your father and later your husband, and a strong sense of duty to your family and its reputation were paramount. Your education aimed to produce a virtuous Roman matron, one who would uphold the family's honor and produce legitimate children to continue the family line. Unlike your brothers, you were explicitly excluded from the public sphere. There was no training for political office, for legal advocacy, or for military leadership. Your voice was meant to be heard within the home, not in the forum. This created a stark reality for all your education and skills. Your influence would be largely indirect, exercised through your husband, sons, or behind the scenes within the domestic circle. The absence of formal schools for girls beyond elementary literacy also meant that their education was highly individualized, depending entirely on the resources and priorities of their paterfamilias. Some wealthy girls might have exceptionally learned enslaved tutors, while others might receive only the bare minimum of domestic instruction. There was no standardized curriculum, no public oversight. So, as you envision the life of a Roman girl, remember that while she might have been educated, her learning was purposefully constrained. Her classroom was the home, her curriculum the practicalities of domestic life, and her ultimate goal to be a virtuous wife and mother. Her education, though valuable, was primarily homebound with a limited scope, a stark testament to the deeply gendered expectations that defined the lives of Roman women, ensuring that, for all their potential, their intellectual sphere remained largely private. It certainly makes you appreciate modern public education for all genders, doesn't it? You've observed the homebound education of Roman girls. Now, let's confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about Roman education, one that casts a long, unsettling shadow over the entire system, slavery's shadow in the classroom. The reliance on enslaved individuals as tutors, coupled with the disturbing reality of enslaved children being educated, reveals a profound moral paradox at the heart of Roman intellectual life. Imagine a scene in a wealthy Roman domus. A young Roman boy, perhaps you, is diligently practicing his Latin grammar. Standing over him, patiently correcting his mistakes, is a tutor, likely a highly educated enslaved Greek man. This was incredibly common. Many of the most learned individuals in Roman society were, ironically, enslaved. They were often war captives, particularly from the more culturally sophisticated East, or the descendants of such captives, prized for their intellectual skills. This meant that the very foundation of Roman intellectual achievement, from basic literacy to advanced rhetoric, often rested on the enforced labor of enslaved minds. Imagine the inherent contradiction you, as a free Roman citizen, are being taught the virtues of liberty and the glories of Roman achievement by someone who is legally denied their own freedom. The knowledge imparted was invaluable, but the method of its delivery was deeply disturbing, built upon the systemic subjugation of human beings. The tutor might be brilliant, compassionate even, but his existence was entirely at the whim of his master, the pater familias, who could sell him, punish him, or even free him at will. This reliance on enslaved tutors also meant that the quality of education could vary wildly. While some enslaved tutors were highly skilled and dedicated, others might have been less competent or more resentful of their forced servitude. Parents, however, had little recourse if dissatisfied, beyond the threat of harsher punishment for the enslaved tutor. Historians still debate the exact social status and psychological state of these highly educated enslaved tutors, though their foundational role in Roman education is undeniable. But the shadow of slavery extended beyond just tutors. Enslaved children also sometimes found themselves in a classroom of sorts, albeit for vastly different reasons. These were often the children of enslaved household members, or young enslaved individuals purchased for specific domestic roles. Their education was entirely pragmatic, focused on making them more valuable to their owners. Imagine a young enslaved girl, not much older than you, being taught basic literacy and numeracy. This isn't for her intellectual enrichment, it's so she can better manage household accounts, track inventories, or assist the mistress of the house. She might learn to spin and weave, to cook, or to serve guests. Skills that directly benefited her owner. Her education was a form of training for servitude, designed to increase her efficiency and value as property. Similarly, young enslaved boys might be taught to read and write if they were destined for roles as scribes, accountants, or assistants to their masters. Others might receive instruction in trades, carpentry, metalwork, or pottery. Again, skills that directly serve the economic interests of their owners. This education was a calculated investment aimed at maximizing their utility, not at fostering their personal development or intellectual curiosity. This created a disturbing paradox where enslaved children might sometimes receive a rudimentary education, even in literacy, that was denied to many poor freeborn Roman children. However, the context was everything for the freeborn. Lack of education meant limited opportunity. For the enslaved, education meant increased value as property, not an avenue to freedom or upward mobility. A literate enslaved person was still enslaved, their knowledge a tool for their master, not for their own liberation. The very spaces of learning could be permeated by the presence of enslaved people. In the literators or grammaticus' school, you might find enslaved students sitting alongside freeborn boys, though their social status and ultimate prospects were worlds apart. The harsh discipline, the beatings with the ferula, could be inflicted equally upon free and enslaved children, blurring the lines of suffering but not of legal status. So, as you conjure the image of a Roman classroom, remember the unseen figures who often brought the knowledge, and the silent presence of those whose learning was a direct consequence of their bondage. Slavery's shadow in the classroom wasn't just a metaphor, it was a disturbing reality, where intellectual pursuits were inextricably linked to human exploitation, leaving a profound and unsettling mark on the very foundation of Roman education. It truly makes you appreciate universal access to education, doesn't it? And the freedom to learn for your own sake. You face the uncomfortable truth of slavery's pervasive presence in Roman education. Now, let's consider the actual content of what was taught to these Roman boys and girls. And you might find it surprisingly rigid and, dare I say, the curriculum boring and irrelevant. For all its rigor, Roman education was often narrow in scope, deeply conservative, and not always designed to prepare students for the practical realities of most Roman lives. Imagine yourself as a Roman student, moving through the stages of elementary literature and secondary grammaticus education. The core focus, as you recall, was on reading, writing, and arithmetic. While essential, the method of teaching was often tedious. Reading involved endless repetition of dry texts, not engaging stories. Writing was meticulous copying, not creative expression. Arithmetic was practical calculation, not abstract problem solving. There was little room for curiosity, exploration, or individualized learning. It was a utilitarian approach designed to instill basic skills through sheer drill. Then came the heavy emphasis on classical literature, especially for boys progressing to the Grammaticus. You'd spend years dissecting the works of Virgil, Horace, Homer, and other revered authors. While these are foundational texts, the method of instruction was often a dry grammatical analysis. You'd parse sentences, identify rhetorical figures, and memorize vast passages. Imagine spending countless hours analyzing the meter of an epic poem or the subtle nuances of Latin grammar, when what you really wanted to know was how to manage your family's farm or navigate the complexities of urban life. The problem for many was the perceived irrelevance of much of this literary education to their daily lives. Unless you were destined for a political or legal career, which only a tiny elite were, the intricate details of ancient poetry or obscure historical references might have felt utterly disconnected from the realities of running a business, managing an estate, or serving in the military. For the aspiring merchant's son, endless hours on Homer might seem less useful than learning to calculate compound interest, a skill often relegated to specialized, less prestigious training. Historians still debate the degree to which a classical literary education was truly practical for Roman citizens beyond the political elite, with some arguing its primary value was social distinction rather than direct utility. Consider the absence of subjects we deem crucial today. There was no formal science education beyond rudimentary astronomy and geometry, often taught in relation to literature or architecture, not as a field of inquiry in itself. No biology, no chemistry, no physics. Medical knowledge was learned through apprenticeship or from texts, not in a school classroom. There was little to no instruction in practical engineering, despite Rome's incredible achievements in this area, geology, or even advanced economics. The curriculum was also deeply conservative. It focused on the past, on the idealized virtues of ancient heroes, and on established literary forms. There was little emphasis on innovation, critical thought that challenged established norms, or original research. The goal was to transmit existing knowledge and values, not to create new ones. This meant that students were trained to be respectful inheritors of tradition, rather than independent thinkers eager to push intellectual boundaries. It's almost like being taught only ancient philosophy when what you need is a lesson in how to build a working plumbing system. For girls, their curriculum was even more restricted. While practical, focusing on household management and textile production, it still largely ignored intellectual pursuits beyond basic literacy, even if a girl showed a keen mind for numbers or talent for analysis. The educational system simply didn't provide avenues for her to develop these talents beyond their application within the domestic sphere. Their education, while relevant to their prescribed roles, was inherently limited, reflecting the societal belief that a woman's intellectual capacity was secondary to her domestic virtues. The method of teaching, rooted in rote memorization and oral recitation, also made the curriculum incredibly dull. Imagine sitting for hours, listening to monotonous lectures, copying texts, and reciting passages from memory, without the benefit of engaging discussions, interactive activities, or visual aids. The sheer repetition, often enforced by the threat of corporal punishment, could easily extinguish any genuine spark of intellectual curiosity. Learning became a chore, a burden, rather than an exciting journey of discovery. You'd try to keep your mind from wandering, but the drone of the grammaticus and the sheer tedium of the text would often lull you into a daze. So, as you reflect on Roman education, remember that while it produced some of history's most eloquent orators and brilliant minds, for the average student, it was a rigorous, often uninspiring experience. The curriculum, with its heavy emphasis on archaic texts and rote learning, often felt boring and irrelevant, a testament to a system designed to create specific types of citizens rather than foster widespread intellectual curiosity or practical innovation. It makes you feel incredibly grateful for diverse curricula and engaging teaching methods, doesn't it? You've navigated the potentially boring curriculum and the endless memorization, but maintaining order in these crowded open-air classrooms and forcing young minds through such a demanding curriculum required more than just the reader's stern gaze. It relied on a pervasive and brutal reality discipline and drudgery, corporal punishments, cruelty. Physical discipline was not merely an option in Roman schools. It was a cornerstone of their pedagogical approach, applied with a regularity and severity that would horrify modern sensibilities. Imagine a scene in any Roman school, from the literator's basic room to the grammaticus's more advanced setting. The air isn't just filled with the murmur of lessons. It's punctuated by the sharp crack of the cane ferula, the stinging slap, or the dull thud of a fist. This wasn't a rare occurrence for extreme misbehavior. It was a constant, expected part of the learning process. A forgotten line, a mispronounced word, a poorly formed letter on a wax tablet, a moment of inattention, or even a simple fidget could earn a swift, painful blow. The primary instrument of punishment was the ferula, a type of cane or rod, often made from wood or sometimes even a bundle of sticks. Imagine the burning sensation on your outstretched palm as the ferula descends, a sharp, stinging pain that would make your eyes water. Or perhaps it was a lash across your back, leaving a painful welt that would burn for hours. These were not light taps. They were deliberate attempts to inflict pain, to etch lessons into the mind through physical discomfort. The purpose of this brutal discipline was simple: to enforce obedience and memorize material. Roman educators believed that fear was a powerful motivator, and that physical pain was an effective way to focus a child's mind and ensure diligent study. There was no concept of positive reinforcement, no attempts to make learning inherently engaging. The idea was to drill information into young minds through intimidation and repetition. You were expected to learn, and if you didn't, pain was the consequence. Consider the psychological toll on the students. You would sit in constant fear, your stomach clenched, your mind racing, trying desperately to avoid mistakes. Every time the literator or grammaticus raised their hand, a wave of dread would wash over you. This pervasive fear created a stressful learning environment, where anxiety often overshadowed any genuine curiosity or love of knowledge. It taught compliance and fear of authority. Perhaps, but at the cost of true intellectual exploration. While Roman literary sources, like Juvenal's satires, vividly describe brutal schoolmasters and their canes, archaeological evidence for specific disciplinary tools is limited. Though the general acceptance of corporal punishment in ancient childhood is undeniable across the Roman society, the severity of punishments could vary. For minor infractions, it might be a few stinging blows to the hand. For more serious misbehavior, such as persistent laziness, defiance, or disruptive conduct, the beatings could be more severe, administered to the back or buttocks, sometimes with a heavier strap. There was no system of oversight, no school board to complain to. The paterfamilias entrusted his son to the schoolmaster, and the master's authority was almost absolute. Many Roman parents likely approved of, or even expected, such harsh discipline, believing it was essential for instilling virtues and producing obedient, disciplined citizens. The public nature of the punishment also added to the humiliation. Beatings often took place in front of the entire class, serving as a grim warning to other students. You'd witness your classmates crying out in pain, their faces contorted, a chilling reminder of your own vulnerability. This collective exposure to violence further normalized the practice, making it an accepted, if dreaded, part of daily school life. even at the more advanced stages. In the schools of the rhetor, while direct physical beatings might be less frequent for older students, the pressure was still immense, and verbal humiliation could be just as devastating. A public dressing down by the rhetor could crush a young man's confidence and ambition, affecting his entire future career. The competitive environment meant that students would often internalize this pressure, pushing themselves to avoid any perceived failure. So, as you picture a Roman student hunched over their wax tablet, remember the ever-present shadow of the ferula? Roman education, for all its grand aspirations, was fundamentally built on a foundation of discipline and drudgery, where learning was often extracted through the painful application of corporal punishment. It was a harsh, unyielding system, a true testament to the cruelty of ancient pedagogy. It certainly makes you feel grateful for sympathetic teachers and a generally nonviolent approach to education today, doesn't it? You've explored the curriculum and the brutal discipline within Roman schools, but for the vast majority of Roman children, and even for those from wealthier families, formal classroom learning was only one piece of the puzzle, and often a very small one. The real pervasive education happened outside the school walls, through direct experience beyond the classroom. Practical life skills. This informal education, learned through apprenticeships and domestic roles, was absolutely crucial for survival and integration into Roman society. Imagine you are a Roman boy from a plebeian family, perhaps living in a bustling neighborhood of Rome. You might attend the literator's school for a few years, learning basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. But around the age of 12 or 13, your formal education would likely end abruptly. It was time for you to contribute to the family's livelihood. Your real education would begin in an apprenticeship. You would be placed under the tutelage of your father, an uncle, or a master craftsman in a specific trade. This could be anything from a baker to a blacksmith, a potter to a carpenter, a stonemason to a shopkeeper. Imagine spending your days in a noisy, dusty workshop, learning by doing. You'd start with the most menial task, sweeping the floor, carrying materials, tending the fire. Slowly, painstakingly, you'd graduate to more complex skills, observing your master, mimicking his movements, and enduring his often gruff instructions. You'd learn the precise way to mix mortar, to shape metal, to throw clay on a wheel, or to weigh out goods for customers. This was a deeply practical education, focused entirely on the acquisition of a marketable skill. There were no abstract theories or philosophical debates here. It was all about hands-on experience, repetition, and mastering the craft. You'd learn the unspoken rules of the trade, the tricks of the guild, and the nuances of dealing with customers. Your hands would become calloused, your muscles strong, and your mind sharp with the practicalities of earning a living. This informal training was the backbone of the Roman economy, producing the skilled artisans and laborers who built the very infrastructure of the empire. While formal guilds existed, the bulk of practical skills was transmitted through informal, often multi-generational apprenticeships within family workshops or small businesses. For boys from wealthier families, even if they continued to the grammaticos and rhetor, their education was also supplemented by practical training, albeit of a different kind. They might accompany their fathers to the forum, observing legal proceedings, listening to political speeches, and learning the intricacies of Roman public life. They'd learn about client relationships, patronage, and the subtle art of political maneuvering by direct observation. This was their apprenticeship in governance and power, far more valuable than any textbook lesson. Now, consider the Roman girl, especially from a non-elite family. As we've discussed, her formal schooling was minimal, often limited to the very basics. Her true education from an early age revolved entirely around domestic roles and household management. Her classroom was the home, and her teachers were her mother, grandmother, and older female relatives, or sometimes an enslaved matron. She would learn to cook over an open hearth, mastering the preparation of Roman staples like pulse porridge, baking bread, and preparing vegetables. She'd learn to spin wool, transforming raw fleece into thread, and then to weave that thread into fabric on a loom. This was a continuous, labor-intensive process, vital for clothing the family. Imagine the rhythmic thump-thump of the loom, the painstaking work of preparing the wool, all while managing younger siblings. Beyond these practical crafts, she would learn the complex art of household management. This involved overseeing the food stores, managing the household budget if her mother allowed it, and supervising any enslaved individuals. She'd learn about basic herbal remedies for minor illnesses, how to preserve food through salting or drying, and how to maintain cleanliness such as it was in the home. Her training was comprehensive, preparing her for her future role as a materfamilias, the mistress of her own household. These practical skills were not optional. They were essential for survival. A boy who couldn't master a trade would struggle to find employment and support a family. A girl who couldn't manage a household efficiently would bring shame upon her husband and family. This informal, experiential learning, often enforced with strict discipline, was the true bedrock of Roman society, ensuring that each generation was equipped with the necessary tools for daily life. The lack of formal, standardized vocational training meant that the quality of these practical skills varied greatly, depending on the individual master or mother. But the hands-on nature of the learning meant that skills were deeply ingrained, passed down through generations, and adapted to the specific needs of the Roman household and economy. It was a rigorous, demanding education, perhaps lacking in academic flair, but undeniably effective in preparing Romans for the harsh realities of their world. So, as you reflect on Roman education, remember that the true learning for most happened beyond the classroom. It was a continuous process of apprenticeship and practical application, a relentless immersion in the skills necessary for daily survival. It makes you realize how much we rely on formal institutions for our learning today, doesn't it? You've witnessed the brutal literator, the tedious grammaticus, the high-stakes rhetor, the homebound girls, the shadow of slavery, the often irrelevant curriculum, the pervasive corporal punishment, and the vital practical skills learned outside the classroom. As we conclude our exploration of Roman education, let's reflect on a legacy of inequality and stress how this foundational system, for all its occasional brilliance, was deeply flawed, inherently unequal, and often traumatic for those who endured it. Imagine looking back at your Roman education, perhaps from the vantage point of old age. You might feel a sense of pride in your knowledge of Latin and Greek, your ability to speak persuasively, or your mastery of a trade. But beneath that pride lies a complex tapestry of hardship, privilege, and missed opportunities. The most glaring part of this legacy is the profound inequality of access. Education in Rome was not a universal right, it was a luxury. The vast majority of Roman children, particularly the poor and enslaved, received no formal schooling whatsoever. Their lives were dedicated to immediate survival and labor, denying them any chance at intellectual development beyond basic practicalities. This cemented a rigid social hierarchy, ensuring that knowledge and power remained concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. The very foundation of Roman society was built on this educational divide. For those who did attend school, the legacy was often one of stress and fear. From the tender age of 7, children were subjected to rote memorization, relentless drills, and the constant threat of brutal corporal punishment. Learning was often extracted through pain, fostering obedience rather than genuine curiosity. Imagine the psychological toll of constantly being on guard, terrified of a misstep that could result in a stinging blow. This stressful environment likely crushed many budding intellects and instilled a lifelong aversion to formal learning. The narrow and conservative curriculum further contributed to this problematic legacy. While it produced eloquent orators and learned scholars of classical texts, it often neglected practical sciences, critical thinking beyond rhetorical debate, and subjects that would genuinely prepare students for the diverse realities of Roman economic and social life outside politics and law. For many, the education felt irrelevant, a demanding exercise in memorization that offered little direct utility. While some modern scholars highlight the Roman emphasis on practical skills outside the classroom as a form of hidden curriculum, others argue it doesn't negate the significant gaps in formal academic subjects like natural sciences. The reliance on enslaved tutors presents a deep moral paradox. The very brilliance of Roman intellectual life was often built on the enforced servitude of highly educated human beings. This fact casts a long shadow over any celebration of Roman educational achievement, reminding us of the profound human cost underlying their system. The education of enslaved children, while offering some literacy, was ultimately a tool for their owners, not a path to liberation or self-actualization. For Roman women, the legacy of their education was one of inherent limitation. Despite potentially achieving high levels of literacy and cultural refinement, their learning was explicitly confined to the domestic sphere. They were educated to be efficient household managers, virtuous wives, and mothers, but never public intellectuals, lawyers, or politicians. This reinforced a patriarchal society that valued their domestic contributions, but systematically denied them public agency and intellectual freedom beyond prescribed roles. Finally, Roman education was a system that, while laying some groundwork for later Western educational traditions, was fundamentally about social reproduction. It was designed to perpetuate the existing class structure, to train the elite for leadership, and to equip the common folk for labor. It was effective in its purpose, but it was far from equitable, nurturing, or universally accessible. So, as you reflect on the grandeur of ancient Rome, remember the silent struggles within its classrooms. The legacy of Roman education is a complex one, a testament to the power of knowledge, but also a stark reminder of the profound inequalities, harsh disciplines, and inherent limitations that defined learning in a world so different from our own. It makes you feel incredibly grateful for every aspect of your modern educational experience, doesn't it? All right. As the last echoes of our journey through ancient Roman education fade into the quiet of the night, it's time to gently bring our minds back to the present. You've sat in their dusty classrooms, felt the sting of the ferula, and grappled with the harsh realities of learning in a world so different from our own. It's a powerful reminder that history, in its quietest corners, often reveals the most poignant truths about human resilience and the long, winding path of progress. Let the images of cramped classrooms, boring lessons, and the rigors of discipline slowly fade away, giving way to the quiet peace that surrounds you. The smell of old ink and the tense atmosphere of competition fade, giving way to the familiar comfort of your own space. Let any lingering thoughts of inequality and academic pressure gently drift away, replaced by a sense of relaxation and peaceful reflection. The struggles and limitations of ancient education are now, temporarily, part of your understanding, enriching your sense of history and the value of learning in a freer and more equitable world. As your breathing deepens and your body relaxes, know that the stories of the past are always here, waiting patiently to be rediscovered whenever you seek a gentle escape into the depths of time. But for now, the journey is complete. Rest easy, knowing that another story has been revealed. Gently. Just for you.